Firstly, so thank you everyone for coming along to our campaign discussion meeting about scrapping NRPF, no recourse to public funds. I'm Josh, I'm a councillor in Stevenage and I'm on the steering committee of the Labour Campaign for Free Movement. Before I kick things off, and I should probably hit that now, I'm going to say that what we're doing today is we're going to be recording the contributions from the panel, but not from the Q&A session. So although it says recording at the moment, I'll pause that when we get round to the point where people want to ask questions or make contributions from the floor. So to sort of briefly introduce why we're here because basically 3 or 4 weeks ago, the Prime Minister admitted something to the nation. He said that despite holding the position that he does, he has no knowledge of the cruel system of policies that affect migrants, that is, no recourse to public funds. These are conditions imposed on migrants with or without visas and leave to remain. They deny access to the social safety net. Things such as social housing and even things as punitive as means-tested free school meals for migrant children, alongside many other benefits. The results of this are inhumane, they're unjust, and they serve to divide workers. As a policy, simply it is racist, and we believe as the Labour Campaign for Free Movement that we must end these policies. That's why us, alongside the Labour Homelessness campaign and many other activists and campaign groups have pledged to fight to abolish these and win justice for all of those this currently affects. So this evening we're joined by some of them. So we're joined by Shaista Aziz, who's a councillor in Oxford and is on the Labour Homelessness campaign. Benjamin Morgan, who works at the Public Interest Law Centre and is a migrants' rights activist. We have Polly. Polly is a migrant care worker who is currently subject to NRPF, and also Ben Towse, who is on the Labour Campaign for Free Movement Steering Committee alongside myself. We're also joined by Elena on the panel, who is going to be keeping an eye on the chat so I don't lose track of things, and joining us as a co-chair. So we hope this space will help amplify the struggles against NRPF and build our campaigns and the networks within which we can once and for all scrap these evil policies. We advertised the event with Kate Ossamore, who was due to join us. Now, I've got to say, unfortunately, she's had to send her apologies, as has another event to go to at last minute. Now, that being the case, if things come up that we want to make clear or we want Kate to know about and ask her to get involved in, LCFM are very happy to push these things with her. So if any queries come up that the sorts of things that we should be asking Kate Ossamore to help with, put these in the chat and we can do our best to try and get her to answer those. So in terms of speakers, each person's going to have 7 to 10 minutes or so, 10 minutes absolutely tops because we've started a bit late. I'm then going to open the floor to questions on clarification, technical issues. So if there's anything that the speaker said that you just want clarified, we'll go through those first. And then we'll move on to the point where we can have questions that are a bit more general, political points, how we're actually going to build this campaign. So as I said earlier, I'm recording at the moment. I will pause that when we get round to the Q&A. And we're going to start with Shaista. So please take it away. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and thanks, Josh, for the introduction. And it's great to be here. It's really important that this meeting is being organised, so I really appreciate everybody involved in doing this and everyone attending. As you say, we're in a situation where everybody wants to talk at migrants, talk about refugees, talk about asylum seekers. The state's policies towards people who are categorised in this way are becoming more and more pernicious, despite the fact that the Prime Minister claims he doesn't know what no recourse to public funds are. There has been a great deal of awareness over the past few years around the hostile environment and what it is, specifically around Windrush. That was a particular moment, a shameful moment in British history that did get a lot of traction with the public, but I feel like that has kind of fallen off a little bit just because there's so much going on. And also in many people's minds, they believe that the Windrush situation was resolved, and they believe that people were compensated and received what they needed to receive in terms of justice. Now, we all obviously know that's not true. So I start at this point because I feel very strongly that no recourse to public funds still is overwhelmingly a mystery to the general public. They don't really understand what this means, and including the Prime Minister, who, when he was asking the most absurd questions about no recourse to public funds. He seemed very shocked at the very nature of the policy that he's, him and his government are responsible for implementing. And I do think that this is part of the challenge that we have as campaigners, to really break this down and break it down in such a way that we're not watering down or whitewashing what this is, but we're making it easier for people to understand the day-to-day reality of this. So as Josh said, I'm a Labour councillor here in Oxford, and I'm also the co-founder of the Labour Homelessness campaign. So I'm going to take up a small amount of time that's been allocated to me to specifically talk about homelessness. So right now in Britain, more than 320,000 people are homeless. This includes people with rough sleeping, which has gone up 169% since the Tories took power. Nearly 800 people have died on the streets of this country in the past year. At the Labour Homelessness campaign, which was established 2 years ago, it's a grassroots campaign focused on building solidarity, specifically with the people experiencing this reality. And we're very proud to say that our ethos is about centering people's agencies and reality. But we very clearly believe that this is a political choice. Homelessness is a political choice, and it's being made every day by those in power. And it stems from many choices, including empty buildings that are sitting in our cities and our towns, while people are literally sitting outside them, trying to survive. So, as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic is having a devastating impact on the most marginalised people in this country, including those who are homeless. So since the coronavirus outbreak started, councils have been given emergency funding to meet a range of costs arising from helping those people who are experiencing rough sleeping, and including those with no recourse to public funds. So this is the first time that this is the first time where the state has made it possible, inverted commas, for people with no recourse to public fund to actually access some housing. Obviously, we know that in practice that's not happening in the way it needs to happen, but this is the first time that people with no recourse to public fund have been included in this. Councils do not receive any specific funding from central government to support people with no recourse to public funds. And data from 2018 and 19 shows that 59 councils were spending £47.5 million a year on services to provide services for people with no recourse to public funds. The funding is inadequate for what we're dealing with. There is a massive housing crisis in this country, which then means there's a massive homelessness crisis in the country, but the two of them intersect. And what's happened in the past few weeks, past few months, I should say, during lockdown, is the government announced that everybody on the streets needed to be put inside a building to be housed to ensure that they stay safe during the coronavirus. Now, the coronavirus lockdown is easing, as we know, but the actual pandemic is still there. The everyone in policy is what this was called, and it's hard to really measure how successful, inverted commas, that's been, but we do know that large numbers of people have been housed by local authorities across the country in temporary accommodation. But we also know that there is no long-term plan for those people. So we've got situations, for example, where people who are experiencing homelessness, including rough sleeping, have been temporarily housed in hotels. Now, in cities like Manchester and other places, there has been a very clear advice that's been given to councils that those people who are in those hotels need to now leave. Where they go to, nobody knows, but there's been clear advice given that they need to go. As I said, there's no real plan of action in terms of what happens to those people. But within the hotels that have been made available, you've got a very complex mix. So you've got a whole range of very vulnerable people in there. So you've got people who are homeless, obviously, in all its forms. But then within that, you've got people with no recourse to public funds. You've got individuals who have survived sexual violence and domestic abuse, for example. Often these are people with no recourse to public funds. So in many ways, it's kind of like a situation where everyone has just been thrown into a space together without any real thought put into how vulnerable they are and what their actual needs really are. So it's worked. It's been hit and miss. This everyone in strategy has been hit and miss across the country, but there's at the moment, there's no real data that shows us, you know, how this has worked as a policy, and what happens if there's a second wave. Does a similar policy, will that be enacted again? And in the meantime, while there is not a second wave, what happens to people who are being told they need to leave? So we've heard from insiders working closely with a network of district councils and also those who are members of the councils who are really lobbying very hard to get the government to understand the situation that people are in. So it won't come as a surprise to say that overwhelmingly the people that we've been speaking to feel very frustrated about the policies coming out from Number 10. And what we know is that nationally there are 15,000 people in guest houses, of whom 6,000 were initially housed under the government everybody in strategy. A few councils up and down the country were quite quick off the mark to get people into accommodation, as I said. Some public health authorities have advised councils to reopen their night shelters, but the government's public health advisors are saying don't do this, it's dangerous. So in places like Los Angeles, where night shelters have opened, 75% of sheltered residents have tested positive for the coronavirus. Now, as we know, the testing of coronavirus is very patchy, to put it mildly, trying to be polite here, okay? So, you know, the system is not in place to actually test people, let alone the most vulnerable people. When it comes to no recourse to public fund, councils are pressing the government on what is their commitment to this. Right now, there is no response. There is also a fear among some councils that if they carry on providing accommodation to people with no recourse to public fund, they could actually end up in a legal situation where they are eventually told by central government that it's actually illegal to do this. Now, the chances of that happening, we don't really know, but there is that fear. So the situation is very critical. And I'd say that as a councillor in a city that is heavily impacted by the homelessness and housing crisis, and a city that is small in comparison to Birmingham and Manchester and other places, we've had a very large number of people that have been housed through this scheme because of the coronavirus. But I think more than anything, what local councils need is support. They need vocal support from campaigners and from individuals who will lobby the government hard on the issue of no recourse to public funds, and will be loud and vocal, and also where possible and where there is where a person's agency is retained, help to tell the stories of individuals being impacted by no recourse to public funds. So I've been doing a lot of work with migrant women in particular. I've been doing this work for a number of years as a counsellor, and during this lockdown specifically, I've been doing a lot of work around domestic abuse. So I've been very visible and very vocal around the issue of domestic abuse, which, as we know, can affect anyone. Overwhelmingly, it affects women and children, but it can affect anyone. And we've had instances and information coming to us, and indeed cases coming to us, involving individuals with no recourse to public funds. And the system simply is not functioning. It's not functioning on a good day, let alone when there's the pandemic. And it's really extraordinary to see how quickly people fall through the cracks. And it's very, very dangerous, obviously. But if you don't speak English, and if you are your immigration status is unclear or is precarious, then you literally are at the mercy of anyone and everyone. And I've had conversations with women in my city who have said very clearly that, look, I have nowhere to go as someone with no recourse to public funds, and therefore my only option really is to go back to my abuser, which clearly is not an option. But the point is, these are the kind of so-called decisions, inverted commas, that people are making because they don't have any other option. And this is a damning situation. So despite the rhetoric that's coming out from the government in terms of, everyone should be housed, no one should be on the streets and all of that, there is no long-term plan. And I think that is something that we really, really need to focus on. there's a lot of really strong campaigning happening now, which I think is fantastic and really needed. And I think the issue of homelessness in particular it's really easy for people to understand, because I think more than ever in this country, people understand there's a crisis, homelessness crisis, because they can see it. They can see it on the streets in terms of the numbers of people sleeping rough. We all know that that doesn't tell us the full picture of the housing and homelessness crisis. But what we've seen as the Labour homelessness campaign is this is a very it's an issue that people really understand, and so that is an entry point to enabling them to understand what no recourse to public funds means in relation to that. So we've noticed that, and we've seen also there's been a strong interest from journalists and others to help tell these stories as well. I'll just finish up by saying that more than anything, I think no recourse to public funds, as you rightly said, Josh, is a deeply racist policy. We should never shy away from saying that. We can never say that loudly enough. But it really cuts across every area of our public policy. And that is not known to most people. And I think, as I said at the beginning, that the job I think that we have as campaigners in particular is to really break down what this policy is and what it means in reality for people. Right now, there's so much going on in this country, and it's all interconnected, right? All the institutional and systemic racism is absolutely connected to immigration policy. It's absolutely connected to housing policy. It's connected to all the issues that we care about. But I think that what we have to do is really just break down what no recourse to public funds really means and what that means in reality. So I think if we can do that, then we will start getting more of the public to understand this, because right now it's just a term that I feel is a bit difficult, it's a bit abstract. And this is also the information I've been getting while I've been working with a group of feminist campaigners on the issue of domestic violence and domestic abuse and the impact that it's having on women and on children in particular. So yeah, thank you for giving me some time to speak. And I'm just going to plug my charger in and then wait for the rest of the contribution. So I might just disappear for a few seconds. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I think the interaction with NRPF and local government's really very significant, and councils need this money in a major way. So thank you for making those points. Next, we're going to move on to Benjamin Morgan. Benjamin, are you there?
Just to say, first of all, I'm having some technical issues of my own, in the sense that my video is not working, so I'll just have to be a disembodied voice, if that's okay. Josh introduced me as a migrants' rights activist, which I suppose I am, but first and foremost, I think I'm a welfare advisor. I work for the Public Interest Law Centre, which is a legal organisation, a legal charity that seeks to hold public authorities and public bodies to account when they break the law. And my background is in giving welfare advice to migrants with insecure immigration status, including people with no recourse to public funds. I used to work for Hackney Migrant Centre and for Praxis before that. I wasn't planning to go into the kind of technical welfare aspects of NRPF in my talk, because I wanted to be a bit broader than that and be a bit more political. But if anybody wants me to do that, or to answer more technical questions about the welfare or the legal side of NRPF, I'm happy to try to do so afterwards. So please feel free to ask. I wanted to start with a quick quote from one of our clients, though. The client's name is Mohammed, and he became homeless at the end of March, just after the lockdown. Just a quote from Mohammed. "I thought about killing myself when they wouldn't give me a room. I thought about jumping in front of a train. I told them I had an underlying health condition, that I had asthma on top of that. I've been on antidepressants for a long time. I sent them all the medical evidence, but they still didn't help me. This is Tower Hamlets Council he's talking about. I started getting ill. I was spending too much time outdoors. I had cold sores and I had a fever. I thought I might have coronavirus. It was terrible, but by then I wasn't scared. I knew my life didn't have value. So that's Mohammed saying, I knew my life didn't have value. Mohammed was made homeless because he has NRPF. He couldn't get housing benefits or help with housing costs. So his landlord put him out on the streets in a pandemic. And he was denied support initially by Tower Hamlets, also because he has NRPF. He was told they couldn't help him in a pandemic. So I wanted to make two main points, really. Firstly, that no recourse to public funds, NRPF, raises really important issues about value, really important questions about value, and particularly about the value that we assign to human life. And the other thing I wanted to say was, or to suggest, was that opposing no recourse to public funds is about asserting a different idea of value and human worth, and asserting an idea of value that is distinct and different and stands in opposition to the one that the Home Office tries to sell us. So I think a significant part of what we're fighting when we're fighting NRPF is the racist ideology that speaks clearly through the new immigration bill. The ideology of a skills-led and points-based immigration system. The idea that human beings can be sorted into hierarchies of value, or admitted or refused entry according to where they come from or what skill set they possess. This idea, the idea of paying in before you get anything back, also comes across in the Home Office's language on no recourse to public funds. If you look at their press releases on NRPF, they remind us that, quote, those who benefit from the state must contribute towards it, end quote. And I'm not trying to say at all that people like Mohammed don't have skills or that they don't contribute to society. If people with NRPF have, and they do, both of those things. What I'm trying to say, I think, is that opposing no recourse to public funds is fundamentally about opposing policies and a politics that implies that people's right to care and shelter and a decent standard of living depends on how many points they have, or how much they earn, or where they come from. And opposing NRPF is about standing up for care and shelter and a decent standard of living as basic social rights. And about saying we shouldn't be asking anyone to prove at the moment when they need help that they deserve help. I think another point with NRPF is that we need to recognize that policies based on the idea that some people deserve care and help and shelter more than others are not only obscene, but they're also the product of a broader political and economic rationality. So we need to acknowledge and communicate in our activism around NRPF the relationship between inhumane border policies and capitalism and neoliberalism. The number of people living in the UK who are not allowed to access welfare benefits or help with housing easily runs into the millions. NRPF applies to people on student visas, people on work visas, people on spouse visas, and people who don't have visas. It also applies to EU citizens who haven't worked enough, or haven't worked recently enough, or haven't lived in the UK long enough to qualify for benefits of social housing. Most people on NRPF are on low incomes. Some people with NRPF are poor beyond the imagining of most people living in the UK. I've worked with families of 5 who share a single unventilated room. That's with children. I've worked with a single mother of 2 teenagers who survived for a long time on around £40 a month. The 3 of them. Most people with no recourse to public funds are in work, whether they're working legally or otherwise. People with NRPF have to work because they have no social safety net. Moreover, they're not usually in a position to quibble about the salary they receive or about a furlough scheme when a pandemic starts, whether because their visa depends on their job or because they have no visa and therefore no employment rights, or just because they know that if they're not working, they might not be able to eat. NRPF creates a class of hyper-exploitable and easily disposable workers. Denying welfare benefits is one of several ways, it's not the only way, in which this immigration system seeks to extract value from migrant bodies. I think it's also really important to say that a disproportionate number, though not everybody, a disproportionate number of people with NRPF are people of colour. The NRPF system, like apartheid, is a racialized system of second-class citizenship. So in a time when everybody's attention is rightly on state violence against communities of colour, I think we need to be making those connections as well. So no recourse to public funds, the system maintains that some people are more worthy of care and safety and shelter than others because of where they came from. More discreetly, the NRPF system works to exert disciplinary power over low-paid workers. You think of all the people with NRPF who might have stopped working during the lockdown and during this pandemic if they'd been able to afford to do so, but had to carry on working. I think it's also really important to have a post-colonial perspective on NRPF. It's no recourse to public funds is yet another way that the British state stops people from former British colonies getting their hands on the spoils of empire. So it's a system of second-class citizenship, and it's a very violent system, and the damage it does is sometimes subtle and sometimes less subtle. Mohammed, who I quoted from at the beginning, became homeless because he couldn't get any benefit to help him pay his rent. He stayed homeless, he slept in the park because his council told him that he couldn't be placed in emergency accommodation because he had NRPF. Reading Mohammed's words, I'm always reminded of Ruth Gilmore's definition of racism as the production of vulnerability to premature death. The production of vulnerability to premature death. No recourse to public funds stops women from fleeing domestic violence. It stops victims of trafficking leaving their exploiters. It forces people into destitution, sometimes for many years. It causes psychological trauma in terms of the development of children. It causes anxiety and despair to adults and parents. Mohammed, who I quoted from, was eventually accommodated by Tower Hamlets after the threat of legal action. He's currently sitting in a hotel, desperately worried about what's going to happen next, whether he's going to be evicted. He's been given a letter saying that he's not eligible for support. They haven't kicked him out yet. I also wanted to say that acknowledging that NRPF is about value and it's about values, and recognizing the violence that NRPF does has implications for how we organize to oppose it. I wanted to suggest that one of the implications is that we need to be really broad in our activism around NRPF, but at the same time quite specific and quite careful. And I think what I mean, one example of what I mean by this is, you know, in a time of pandemic, it's very tempting to call for a temporary suspension of NRPF rather than an end to NRPF. You know, to accept that eventually things will go back to normal in this country, and therefore we'll go back to a status quo where some people have to sleep on the streets because of their immigration status. I also think it's really tempting as campaigners to limit the calls that we're making for access to a social safety net to particular groups of people. For example, to ask for an end to no recourse to public funds for people who have leave to remain, or for families with children, or for people who were born in the UK, or an end to NRPF for domestic workers. It's very tempting to lean on emotive and emotional narratives, and sometimes we have to, about key workers and mothers with children. It's also tempting to meet the Home Office on its own terms by talking about the economic and social contribution of migrants with NRPF. But I wanted to suggest that if we campaign in that way, then we risk shoring up the same hierarchies of value and of deservingness and of human worth that in turn shore up the system, the immigration system that we want to change or get rid of. And that we need to tell different kinds of story when we're talking about NRPF, rather than trying to prove that people with NRPF deserve help, as if it wasn't self-evident. I wanted to suggest, and I think it's a really important point, that those of us with secure immigration status—
You make this your final point, Benjamin, sorry.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah. Those of us who have access to public funds need to support and empower people with NRPF to speak up and to organize for justice and to do it with them and alongside them. And that until there is a change, we need to be providing practical solidarity, whether it's financial support or other things, because people need to get by. And I also wanted to suggest that out of a recognition that NRPF is not something that affects foreigners, but something that affects our communities, whose members come from all over the world, we need to make sure that we align our demands on NRPF with system-wide and internationalist demands for racial and economic justice, and with various kinds of abolitionism. I'll stop there. I'd be really keen to kind of pick up the point with Shaista, the more specific point about local authorities, but maybe we can do that later.
That's really great, Benjamin. Thank you. The story you told, Mohammed's story, I think it really underlines what it is we're up against here and why we need to, get rid of this policy outright. You raised a point at the start about sort of legal and technical questions. So I suggest that if anybody has any specific things like that, we deal with that before we do a general Q&A. But before we get there, I'm going to I'm going to invite Polly to speak. Polly is a care worker and subject to NRPF and is a whistleblower. Polly, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Over to you, okay?
All right, thank you. So, hi everyone. I'm Polly. Thank you, Josh, for the opening introduction. Just to make some few points, actually, I'm not subjected to the NRPF. Is my partner who has this on his leave to remain. So because we now live together, because before we agreed to live together, I wasn't having any problem accessing public funds. I was all right. But when we moved in together, one of these policies is if any member of your family or any member of your household has this no resource for public fund, you are subjected to it automatically. So you may not really understand how deep this policy is and how terrible it is actually for one even to invent it in the first place and force it on people is deadly. So I was all right. I don't have it, but it's my partner that has it. So it affects me and my entire household. So that is one thing. I will be starting from giving an update from the last time I gave a voice note or a video regarding the potential safeguarding issues for residents in care homes if they happen to have people working alongside them. Just as myself, I am now affected by no resource, no access to public funds. If I catch the virus or any member of my household has it, I cannot even imagine to think about self-isolating, because to me it's like a deadly mission. It's totally out of order. It's like the last thing I would think about, because just like we've mentioned earlier, you are now entitled to any of the social benefit and you're on your own, so to say. Now, while I was at work last weekend, Sunday, my colleague was coughing and seems to have some of the symptoms of the virus. So I was wondering, why is she not self-isolating? Because that kind of worried me a bit, because we have a vulnerable resident who is receiving care. So I then I then approached her kind of. I asked her, do you know anything about this 2.5 years visa? Because this no access to public fund is actually applied to those with limited leave to remain, and it's 2.5 years. So she laughed and looked at me and said that actually, as a matter of fact, that she needs to be renewing hers in a month's time, that she and her daughter has to pay to the Home Office £5,000. And this is after the Home Office has removed the NHS fee. Now it stands at £5,000 because she has to pay for herself and for her daughter, and also the legal fees as well attached to it. So she needs to make £5,000 in a few months' time to pay to renew her papers. And we must understand that these are people who are working, earning £7.88, £8 something, earning less than minimum wages, earning less than London living wage. This is how much they have to cough out to the Home Office every 2.5 years. And we understand that living in London is so expensive. Rent is expensive in London. And when you're working in such a way that you cannot even afford to pay your rent, not to mention paying the Home Office this huge amount of money every 2.5 years. So when she said that, that brought tears to my eyes. I looked at her. I just imagined myself, like, this is what I will be doing if I have the symptom, or if any member of my household has these symptoms. I will have to come to work. So it actually brought me back to what I was actually crying out 2 weeks to 3 weeks ago about the dangers this could place on people. I just see that happening in real life. Now, just before we finished work that day, she received a phone call that her child was seriously ill, was having cold, like her daughter was having fever. Her child had fever and was vomiting, not really eating well. She had to leave work and then go home to attend to her daughter. Now, this is in line with the government policy regarding self-isolating for 14 days. But as I speak to you, my colleague has done 36 hours shift since Sunday till now. So, which means she cannot also imagine observing the self-isolation. She cannot self-isolate. To her, it's unthinkable, it's unimaginable, because she has to pay. She has to pay the £5,000 in few months' time. She has to pay rent. She has to feed her child. No one else could ever cater for her. If she doesn't do that, she will risk homeless. I mean, there are so many aspects of this no access to public fund that people may not really understand until it hits home. It's real. Now, I need us to understand this. Having this no resource to public fund keeps us, leaves us at a higher risk of catching coronavirus on a daily basis, because you will be working alongside someone whose family or whose household or who's a member of household has got the virus, but because they cannot self-isolate, they have to come to work, which by doing so, they are undermining the government policies about self-isolating. So you who have got no issues are at risk because you're working alongside people who have got this problem. It's not just only about migrants anymore. It's now about the entire public health. It's about all of us. So leaving this here does not help issues at all. It's now everyone's problem. You will be working alongside a person, even if you're British or you're not British. If your wife or your partner or whatever has got this on their leave to remain, you are directly, automatically affected by it. And if you do not comply, you will risk your loved one will be deported. That's what happened to me. That is the situation I found myself in today. And this is why I'm crying out. It is dangerous. I think one thing this government should have done in the middle of pandemic, even before asking people to self-isolate, was to first of all remove this barrier. Because so long as this barrier is there, no one is going to self-isolate. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult because we work so hard. You need to see how hard people work in care homes, even in hospitals, in NHS, everywhere, every sector. We work so hard. We sweat like pig when we are working. At the end of every 2.5 years, we make an account to our tax masters in the 21st century in Britain in 2020. So imagine how hard someone is working £7.88 will have to make every 2.5 years to make an account to the Home Office. Imagine how hard that is. Now you have to pay your rent. You have to pay your council tax and other bills. And at the end of the day, if anything happens to you, no one cares about you. I asked my colleague, how long have you been in the UK? She told me she came to the UK when she was 4 years old. Today she's 25. Her child is 3 years old. So she's been in this system of 2.5 years for a long time. Now, if the government policy is saying anyone who wants to benefit or reap from the society should be able to contribute to it, my question to them is, how long are we going to keep? How long are we going to keep working? How long are we going to keep paying into the tax system? How much are we going to keep laboring before we begin to reap? How long is this going to have to be? Is it a permanent thing? Is it indefinite? Is it indefinite? This is why we cannot afford to live in a home that is not full of dumps. This is why we cannot afford to live this is why we cannot afford to live in a decent environment. This is why we cannot afford to live in houses that is not crowded. This is why we cannot afford a decent meal. This is why we cannot afford to eat a healthy meal. This is why people have to cling on coke and sugary food, and diabetes is their next door neighbor. This is why when they catch coronavirus, they die from it because they've got no other choice. So it is actually deeper than what we could ever imagine, and it's directly affecting all of us. all of us in the UK, as long as this no resource to public fund is concerned, and when people have the symptom of coronavirus, they cannot self-isolate. Where does that leave all of us? Especially we who work in direct contact with them, with everyone. Working in health and social care, you work in direct contact. There is nothing like social distancing. You cannot social distance. So these places, myself, my colleagues, the residents are at risk. So now I have a question for the Prime Minister, because it seems that he does not understand what the no cost for public funds is. Now I'm gonna ask him to do me a favor. So, dear Prime Minister, just imagine when you were in hospital receiving care with coronavirus. Imagine one of the nurses who stood by you had a family member who could not self-isolate. Imagine they could not self-isolate because they've got a family member in their household who has got this no resource to public fund, and they have to be at work passing out and spreading the virus. What would that be your fate? Imagine this is what we go through every day. Your fiancé just gave birth recently. Imagine the midwives who helped her could not self-isolate because they've got no resource to public funds. What would have been the fate of your child or of your fiancé? This is the fate of every resident in the hospital, in the care home. This is the fate of every resident in care homes. This is the fate of every patient in the hospital. This is the fate of every care worker, every NHS worker. So we have no choice. So my plea with you today is, please help us protect our lives while we save other people's lives. This is a simple thing. Removing the no resource to public fund would actually help people to observe the self-isolating policy. Without you removing the no resource to public funds, we cannot imagine self-isolating. We cannot imagine to self-isolate. So it's a simple message. And I think if I was in position of power, I would have removed it before I create the policy of self-isolating, because without you removing this, dear Prime Minister, this is not gonna get us to anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Polly. Firstly, apologies for getting your introduction wrong. It's my fault entirely. But there's really, really important points there about public health policy and what no recourse to public funds does. So thank you for making those. I'm now going to pass over to Ben Towse. Ben is also on the Labour Campaign for Free Movement Steering Committee. In the interest of time, I'm just going to hand over now.
Hi.
You there, Ben?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hi. Yeah, I'm Ben. I'm a council housing worker and a Unison member. I'm an activist with the socialist group Workers' Liberty. I guess I would start just with a small thing that I think we need to be conscious of as a Labour campaign. Someone said earlier that this is a policy that that Boris Johnson's government and the Conservatives are responsible for, and they are. But the legislation under which no recourse to public funds is enforced is a bill passed under Tony Blair in 1999, if I'm correct, or 98. Under the landslide New Labour majority in Parliament. This is not something that Labour is innocent of, and it's something we need to be redoubling our efforts to scrap, I think, because of that. But what I want to talk about is something Benjamin alluded to, that the precarity that no recourse to public funds creates needs to be understood in the context of the balance of forces between workers and employers. It's fundamentally, it's a disciplinary tool. If you know that losing your job could mean absolute destitution, could mean your children being denied school meals, could mean homelessness, that you have absolutely no social safety net, then fundamentally that massively impedes your ability to stand up to your boss. It massively impedes your ability to stick your head over the parapet and unionize. It massively impedes your ability even just to say screw it, I'm not going to put up with this anymore, I'm going to quit, and I'm going to look for another job. Fundamentally, this is something that empowers employers and creates a class of workers who are particularly like hyper exploitable, like Benjamin spoke about. This is not something unique to no recourse to public funds. It's a feature of lots of migration controls. I want to tell you a story about tube cleaners on the Underground. So this was about 12 years ago when Boris Johnson was Mayor of London. At the culmination of 5 years of work organising cleaners on London Underground, who were huge proportions of whom were migrants, they got a level of union density and agreement that they called strike ballot for a living wage, for sick pay, holiday pay, and basic dignity. There was a 99% vote in favour of strike action. They were also tackling sexual harassment, bullying from managers. They had hugely effective strikes. Some depots had 100% participation. Trains and stations were left filthy. After 72 hours of strike in 2 batches, Boris Johnson was forced to concede, agreed a living wage. They didn't get everything they wanted, but they got a living wage. And that was a massive celebration. And it was arguably, given the composition of the workforce, which is always hard to tell because you don't want to, necessarily keep records of who is documented and undocumented. But it seemed likely that this was probably the largest dispute of undocumented migrant workers in British labour movement history. So what happened immediately afterwards was the outsourcing cleaning companies, with the support and the cooperation of London Underground, started utilising the border system to completely smash up the union. They had situations where cleaners showed up to work and immigration agents were waiting for them, called in by the managers. Managers started asking for national insurance numbers that they carefully had not asked for in years. They knew what they were doing when they employed undocumented migrants, and when it became convenient to smash up the union, they deported ringleaders and scared everyone else back into compliance. Since then, there have been efforts at organisation among cleaners by seriously brave people, but it has been impossible to get anything like the level of action that was achieved back then, because people have learned that standing up against the boss could mean deportation. This is also something true of the guest worker visa system. There's the agricultural guest worker system that looks like it's going to be expanded when the immigration bill is put through. So instead of migrating under free movement, and it's absolutely not as if exploitation doesn't happen under free movement, but if you're here on a 6-month visa scheme where your employer likely provides your accommodation, where it's nearly impossible to move between employers, you are absolutely at the mercy of the boss. Farm employers have said on record, it provides, quote, a source of labour that is guaranteed to remain with the farm during the harvest period. So in a very real sense, it's not migration that undermines pay and conditions, it's border controls that undermine pay and conditions. And this is something that Labour needs to understand and promote actually about social security in general. A good social safety net isn't just charity for the vulnerable, it's solidarity. It's a matter of creating a shield for all workers against employers, not just the ones that need to draw on benefits at any given moment, which is why the stuff that Rachel Reeves came out with a few years ago about Labour being the party of those in work and not out of work was so fundamentally dangerous, because it created those categories as if people don't move constantly between those two categories, as if the provisions for people in work, out of work, are not needed by those in work. this is a big part of why we're a Labour campaign for free movement. So we've heard a lot about the intense level of inhumanity that is created by this policy. And on that alone, yeah, it's an abomination and it needs to be scrapped. But it is also something we need to drive home as an argument in our unions and in our communities, that as workers, wherever we're born, we share a common interest that we don't share with our employers, with our rulers, who might happen to have been born on the same side of an imaginary line on a map. Our interests are with class and not country, and that anyone telling you that you as a worker can benefit, or as a group of workers can benefit from doing over another group of workers, is fundamentally looking to exploit both of you. That's why we've adopted and promote slogans like "Build Unions, Not Borders." Blaming immigrants just lets your boss off the hook, as some anonymous vandal, still the best piece of graffiti I think I've ever seen, scrawled across a UKIP billboard a few years ago. And that's why we need to take this up in the Labour movement. It's outrageous, frankly, that despite the fact that we dragged the Labour Party to the left, supposedly, by 2017, we were still proposing the promotion of no recourse to public funds in our manifesto. In 2019, when we passed policy through the Labour Party conference against a lot of resistance from not just the sort of bureaucratic machinery of the party, but a lot of people behind the scenes on the left, it was then left out of the manifesto. That Labour doesn't even dare speak this idea. And the longer we continue to collaborate in this idea that somehow British workers or workers who do have recourse to public funds lose out, the worse it's going to get. Fundamentally, Labour needs to stop triangulating, and clearly that fight is going to have to be taken up by us, in our unions, in our local Labour parties, in our communities. So in terms of things we can do, and I hope that we'll have some discussion about that just quickly. Somebody asked about petition. Actually, we set up a petition on the government petitions website about scrapping NRPF outright. It was about 3 weeks ago. It still hasn't passed moderation yet, so we'll see what comes of that. But I think the next hurdle for us in the Labour Party is that making sure that the opposition to the immigration bill doesn't just say, oh, well, as shamefully, was it Stella Creasy said, oh, well, you know, we agree that, you know, immigration does need new controls, but I'm going to abstain because it's not quite these ones. Yvette Cooper, sorry. Sorry, Stella. The opposition to the bill needs to be founded on these principles, need to be making this argument that we have a different alternative, and it is one that puts class above country, and that says fundamentally we have more in common with each other than we do with the people that exploit us, and that scrapping no recourse to public funds is about equipping us to fight that battle.
Thank you very much, Ben.